Thank you. All right, let's get rolling here. And people are still coming in. I think there's a lot of people on the guest list who hopefully will catch up with us as we continue. So, without further ado, I'm incredibly excited to introduce Andrew Dreelin. I had the privilege of meeting Andrew a couple months ago, actually, at the American Ornithological Society, where all the bird nerds congregate to talk bird stuff and bird conservation. And we did some birding together and talked about some potential future collaborations. And I'm just really excited about all the work he's doing that he's going to be presenting to you today. Andrew is a grassland ecologist who graduated with a BS from Cornell University in 2017, and he is currently finishing up his PhD work at Northern Illinois University in Holly Jones's lab, studying the relationship between grassland birds, as you can tell by his background, and black-tailed prairie dogs, which are an iconic keystone species of the Great Plains. So without further ado, very excited to give the floor to Andrew and looking forward to hearing your talk. Go for it.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the introduction, Henry. Yeah, essentially, you said it. I'm super excited to talk to you today about the first chapter of my dissertation, and it's a literature review on how prairie dogs affect grassland bird ecology. So, yeah, without further ado, this is the keystone effects of prairie dogs on grassland birds. So, current knowledge and future directions. And as a lot of folks here are probably aware, grassland birds are in really, really big trouble. They're the most steeply declining group of birds in North America. Pretty much every grassland bird presentation these days has this figure from Rosenberg et al. 2019 that shows how precipitous these declines are. And my dissertation is really motivated by this because ultimately my goal as a bird lover is to prevent extinctions and help keep ecosystems intact. And so that's really where my role with the Evidence-Based Restoration Lab at NIU and as a fellow with the Smithsonian Great Plains program comes in. And so, because my research is all about applying community ecology research to inform conservation challenges. So kind of taking that holistic approach to ecosystems. And we know a few things that are really setting the stage for this. Essentially, one, there's major knowledge gaps in grassland bird life history, even within, North America, which is comparatively well understood in terms of its bird life compared to the tropics. We also know that American grasslands were drastically altered by how quickly and profoundly European settlement transformed grasslands. And so that just left us with a major knowledge gap because we couldn't study these ecosystems before they were heavily modified. Some things we do know are that disturbance via grazing and fire is key for grassland birds. And that really leads us to the crux of a lot of habitat management for grassland birds today. It revolves around bringing things like prescribed fire to maintain disturbance and heterogeneity for grassland birds, or restoring buffalo, or improving cattle management practices such as through rotational grazing. All of these things maintain or reintroduce disturbance to the ecosystem that grassland birds depend on because they co-evolve with it. So where do prairie dogs come in? And I really have to like, as someone who studies birds and who comes into this topic from a bird standpoint, I'm often trying to uh, introduce prairie dogs to bird-centric audiences. So it's nice that we have a lot of prairie dog lovers in the audience today. But essentially, prairie dogs come in because they are another axis and another source of this valuable disturbance that grassland bird communities depend on. So what you can see here in this figure, this is kind of my version that I've tweaked from a classic figure by Fritz Knopf, showing the spectrum of disturbance intensity and how different parts of the grassland bird community respond and the different types of habitats they occupy under light, moderate, and heavy, either grazing by buffalo, fire intensity and frequency, and then also prairie dog presence. So we're basically trying to advocate that prairie dogs are forming a disturbance triangle, essentially with mega herbivores, fire, and prairie dogs, and that there's essentially this one part of the triangle that we haven't studied as much and we don't know as much about. And we do know that historically prairie dogs had a similar landscape level major impact on grassland ecosystems, much like bison, because there's incredible historical accounts of prairie dogs, in these vast colonies stretching dozens or scores of kilometers. And for me, this painting by George Catlin really encompasses it, because you can see prairie dogs, in the foreground, and they stretch all the way back into the horizon. They just keep going. And unfortunately, we don't really have prairie dogs operating at the same scale today. And much like the decline of bison through European settlement and intentional ecocide, prairie dogs have been similarly eradicated, and competition with beef cattle for forage has been the driving force behind this eradication. And so today, after much poisoning, prairie dogs occupy 2% of their historical range. And when I say prairie dogs here, I mean black-tailed prairie dogs. And this is not just something that happened historically and we're left with the consequences of. This is an ongoing management conflict that is frequently litigated, especially on public land, regarding decisions with competition on maintaining multiple use mandates and trying to strike a balance between biodiversity conservation and agricultural interests. And this leads to a lot of conflict around management. So with the stage set for our context here, and both prairie dogs and grassland birds experiencing severe declines, we set out to ask the following questions to kind of set the stage for just my overall body of research. First off, what do we know about how prairie dogs affect grassland birds? I showed that slide before, but yeah, we want to test our hypotheses and make sure that we really, that the basis that exists in the literature is strong. So we wanted to test hypotheses from the literature, and we also wanted to identify gaps and biases in the literature. This is an especially exciting part to me, and figuring out what we don't know and how to guide future research directions to answer key questions and make sure we're not just making assumptions about how certain things work. And then ultimately, we wanted to synthesize these findings and make some recommendations about how we can interpret these for grassland bird conservation, and thinking about grassland bird conservation in a way that considers the entire ecosystem and all the other pieces that affect grassland bird populations. So our first hypothesis is that prairie dogs increase the occurrence and abundance of species that prefer shorter vegetation, because prairie dog grazing creates suitable habitat compared to nearby grassland. Our second hypothesis is that prairie dog towns host distinct bird communities compared to nearby grassland, because they increase heterogeneity within grasslands at large spatial scales. This goes back to that figure that I showed previously, where, and that ties into the other body of grassland bird work, showing how important heterogeneity is for grassland bird populations. And then our third hypothesis is that prairie dog towns increase the occurrence and abundance of raptors, because prairie dogs are an important prey item for them, like this ferruginous hawk here that's got a prairie dog in its talons. So in order to go about testing these hypotheses, we set out to do a systematic literature review, and this involved a few steps. But to sum it up briefly, we did a database search of Web of Science for peer-reviewed articles using a specific set of keywords. We screened all the records that were returned for essentially relevance for our hypotheses. And after doing lots and lots of reading and screening, and we ended up essentially with a list of 111 papers that directly tested the hypothesis that we were interested in. And there were 166 discrete analyses within those papers. So when you see, when I'm talking about papers or studies, it's that the overall list of publications. And then if I'm talking about analyses, I'm talking about statistical tests that may have occurred multiple times throughout a given paper, since a paper can test multiple hypotheses. And then to make sense of these results, we divided things up into 4 categories based on commonly studied topics. We focused on mountain plovers, raptors, burrowing owls, which we separated from raptors because they were typically studied exclusively. Typically, studies just focused on burrowing owl and didn't study other raptors, or just studied other raptors and didn't include burrowing owl. And then we had a catch-all for general birds, which includes any potential grassland bird that isn't part of the other three groups that I discussed herein, but often involves a lot of grassland songbirds or shorebirds, basically the other suite of grassland birds that we're all familiar with. So I'll walk you through how we evaluated these hypotheses before putting the results up on the screen. So with our first hypothesis about prairie dogs increasing the occurrence and abundance of shortgrass specialist birds, we looked at any analyses that affected the occurrence or abundance, and we evaluated it, determined whether that effect direction of prairie dogs on birds was positive, neutral, or negative. And then we checked our findings against the known habitat associations from the literature. And so, for instance, a supporting paper would be one that found a significant positive response in occurrence or abundance for bird species associated with vegetation height, shorter vegetation in response to prairie dogs. And we found really strong support for this hypothesis. A substantial majority of the analyses supported this idea that prairie dogs are really, really valuable for shortgrass specialist species. And we see this quite clearly with mountain plovers and burrowing owls, but also an entire suite of other grassland bird species. And overall, there were 22 species on our overall species list that responded positively to prairie dogs. Here's 9 of those species highlighted. For me, it's cool to see species that are kind of known associates of prairie dogs, like burrowing owls and mountain plovers that have been received a substantial amount of study, but then also to see certain other species highlighted that we don't necessarily think of as classic prairie dog associates, like chestnut collared and thick-billed longspur and upland sandpiper. For our second hypothesis on how prairie dog towns host distinct bird communities by increasing heterogeneity at large spatial scales, we looked at studies that examined how prairie dog presence affects community composition or beta diversity. And in case you haven't encountered that term, beta diversity is a metric that captures differences between communities in terms of the number of species that they have. So the higher beta diversity, the more distinct to bird communities or communities of any organism are from one another. So support in this context would be finding significant differences in community composition between prairie dog towns and grassland without prairie dog towns, or similar increases in beta diversity. We also synthesize all of the net prairie dog effects of presence and abundance of bird species from our first hypothesis. We put this all in one big figure, so you could see kind of the overall body of literature on how prairie dogs affect certain species abundance. And then we visually assessed this graph, and I'll put that up in just a second. One thing that we did find, there were 20 species on our overall species list that responded negatively to prairie dogs, that decreased in abundance. And these are species that are typically associated with taller grass heights, lower disturbance intensities, or shrubs. And so, yeah, typically species that we think of, on the opposite end of the habitat spectrum from prairie dogs. So species like Baird's sparrow, brewer's sparrow, vesper sparrow, sage thrasher. And what we ended up finding is that 88% of the analyses in our review did support this hypothesis that prairie dogs create different bird communities, different birds inhabit prairie dog towns compared to off prairie dog towns. And so this is that figure that I mentioned. Don't squint too hard at the names. Essentially, what you're just seeing here is in blue, we have studies where species responded positively to prairie dogs. In gray, we have studies where there was not a response of birds to the prairie dogs. And then in red, we have studies where birds responded negatively to prairie dogs. So what's really cool about this to me is it really shows that those kind of divergent communities and that response to heterogeneity, where the species that respond, there's a suite of species that respond positively that are clustered near the top of this graph, and there's a suite of species that respond negatively that are clustered near the bottom of this graph. And those two groups correspond to those selections of species that I put up earlier. And I wanted to take a brief moment to highlight one paper that was not captured in this literature review because it came out after we had conducted our search, but a former Smithsonian intern who worked on our projects essentially took some bird survey data and really ran with it and led a study that examined the effect of prairie dogs at a landscape scale and working around the American Prairie area, Phillips County, Blaine County, Montana, really provides an awesome opportunity to do ecological studies at very, very large spatial scales. And what was cool was he was able to compare entire landscapes in these big blocks that had prairie dogs as part of these landscapes, and landscapes entirely lacking prairie dogs. And there was still a really big response to landscapes, including prairie dogs. And he even found some unexpected associations of certain bird species with prairie dogs that hadn't been previously reported as much in the literature, finding that marbled godwit and brewer's blackbirds were positively associated with prairie dog towns. So I couldn't highlight that in prior presentations, and I'm now happy to finally include that. So yeah, Alex Hahn did some great work on this publication, and I'd happily share it with anyone who's interested. For our third hypothesis on whether prairie dogs increase the occurrence and abundance of raptors because prairie dogs are an important prey item for them, we also saw really strong support using similar metrics of evaluation as in the first topic. So yeah, 88% of our analyses supported this hypothesis. And coming in right at the top are some of the two species that are often thought of as prairie dog associates, ferruginous hawk and golden eagle. Ferruginous hawk in particular has been fairly well studied in terms of how they respond positively to prairie dogs. But at the same time, wanted to highlight that there's this other suite of species that have not been nearly as well studied, but we do see consistent support for a positive presence of prairie dogs on the abundance of these species, including the national bird of the United States, the bald eagle, and then also some migratory species that don't breed on the Great Plains, the rough-legged hawk. This is an Arctic breeding species, but appears to positively benefit from prairie dogs in the winter. That's a pretty cool association to document and see kind of in a bigger context. These aren't just, it's not something that was just reported in a one-off. And then also some other classic grassland birds that may not be eating prairie dogs as much, but might be associated with other species that are spending a lot of time on prairie dog towns. For instance, prairie falcons love to consume hornlarks. They love to just nail hornlarks, especially during winter. And we're again seeing support for prairie falcons, so being attracted to prairie dog towns. So these are really interesting things that I really hope a lot of folks can be inspired by to follow up on in their research. And speaking of following up on more things in research, this brings me to the other half of the presentation, talking about knowledge gaps in the literature. So again, we set out to ask, what are the gaps and biases in the literature? When and where have studies taken place? Are there areas that are being neglected? And what kind of effects have studies investigated? Are there certain kinds of topics that are being less explored? So when we put all of our studies together, we did tag them with coordinates. And so I'll take a moment to orient you as to everything that is going on in this figure. Essentially, what you're seeing here is the location of every study plotted on a map of the Great Plains. And in red, we have breeding season. In blue, we have the non-breeding season. Purple are studies that were year-round. And then the size of these circles scales based on the number of studies. So the larger the circle, the more studies that were conducted at this location. So for instance, in the mountain plover category, we can see this big circle in north central Montana, right around the American Prairie area, where Stephen Dinsmore and his colleagues have done a ton of work on mountain plovers. And so that's why that circle is particularly large there. But as we look at this figure and really break it down, to me, what stands out is the enormous volume of red. And this is in keeping with overall biases in ornithology towards doing studies during the breeding season. So most of these studies on how prairie dogs affect birds occur during the breeding season. And this is, again, in line with other, like the overall knowledge gaps about grassland birds. We know far less about their winter ecology and their migration ecology. And that follows in terms of how prairie dogs affect those aspects of their ecology. One thing we do see for winter and migration, we do see a decent number of studies on raptors during winter, and that's because winter, they're one group of birds that tends to be more obvious out and about during the winter, and prairie dogs appear to be a really important food source for them during winter, often because black-tailed prairie dogs are not hibernating. And so again, this is just kind of highlighting this. But yeah, there's some major knowledge gaps in terms of how prairie dogs affect overall grassland birds during winter and during migration. And then when we do this breakdown again, but just look at studies in terms of how they line up with different prairie dog species. As you might expect, we see that black-tailed prairie dogs are really heavily favored compared to other species of prairie dogs. There's far fewer studies on other prairie dog species. And also, we can see that most of these studies are concentrated in the western part of the prairie dogs range, ironically, where there is plague, and there's far fewer studies that take place kind of in that eastern third of the black-tailed prairie dog range, where there's less plague. And then finally, this chart is displaying the different kinds of effects that that authors studied in terms of what they were looking at. So the way that this is broken down, in green, we have studies on how prairie dogs affected bird occurrence or abundance. Blue are studies on nesting. Orange are studies on diet. And yellow is studies on movement. Gray is studies on survival. So what to me really leaps out here is that there's a very uneven distribution of effect types for certain groups. In the case of mountain plover, the studies are actually pretty well distributed, and it's been comparatively thoroughly studied in terms of how prairie dogs affect these different aspects of their biology. At the same time, there's these major gaps in other areas. So there's been quite a few studies on how prairie dogs affect the occurrence of the general bird community, but very few studies examining how they affect their nesting or their movement or their survival or their diet. And so to me, this is just a knowledge gap that's crying out to be filled. And so kind of taking all of this into account, yeah, when I think about future directions for research studying how prairie dogs affect grassland birds and informing both grassland bird conservation and prairie dog conservation, I think there's a real call for more research outside the breeding season in the central and southern plains and on other prairie dog species besides black-tailed prairie dogs. At the same time, we need more research on how all prairie dog species modify the nesting, movement, diet, and demography of grassland birds so we can better understand the role of prairie dogs in affecting grassland bird populations. Again, we also need longer term research. The median duration of these studies was 2 years. And as folks who have worked in grasslands know, they're incredibly variable environments, often going through cycles of drought and precipitation, and you know, all kinds of different things can happen in a given year. And so it really calls, I think, for long-term research and monitoring to be established so that we can make more informed uh, decisions based on stronger evidence that, yeah, just has that robust background of time and data. And I would also like to point out that it really calls for more collaborative research with indigenous nations. There were only 8 studies that were conducted on tribal land, and Native nations disproportionately steward a large amount of prairie dogs within their remaining habitat, and a lot of tribes do a great job conserving them. And so, yeah, I think this is a big call for more collaborative research that is performed equitably with Native nations. And when we take all these pieces, or at least when I think about some of the conclusions from both testing our hypotheses and then identifying these knowledge gaps, some things pop out to me that I try to really hammer home to folks who care about grassland birds. Essentially, I think we do have evidence here from testing these hypotheses that prairie dogs increase the occurrence and abundance of not just shortgrass specialists, but also raptors, and prairie dog towns host distinct grassland bird communities. The flip side of that is that eliminating or reducing prairie dogs indirectly reduces the occurrence and abundance of imperiled grassland species. In particular, some of those species are mountain plover and chestnut-collared longspurs, which are declining so rapidly that they're listed as very high urgency under the Road to Recovery program, which tracks grassland bird or just overall bird population declines. And so, given declines for both grassland birds and prairie dogs, some policy recommendations come to mind, such as expanding incentives for prairie dog conservation within cattle production systems, establishing protected areas free from that economic pressure and conflict. Also, we really need to improve and scale tools to mitigate sylvatic plague within protected areas so that we can actually maintain prairie dogs within those protected areas. And then we need to continue to support native-led efforts to conserve and restore the prairie dog ecosystem. Of course, I say all of these policy recommendations in a hand-wavy way that makes no mention of how incredibly difficult each one of these bullet points are. I'm sure many of the folks who are on this call have worked with prairie dogs and recognize the steep PR challenges that they face because they are often one of the species that folks in the beef industry are most opposed to restoration efforts of. This is a chart from a study centered in Phillips County, Montana, and so this certainly doesn't represent everywhere. But here you can see a list of potential conservation incentive programs. And when it comes to ranchers' responses in terms of how likely they are to participate in those programs, maintaining prairie dog towns is at the very bottom of that list. And so whether you interpret this as we should focus our efforts on protected areas, and that this advocates for a land sparing strategy as opposed to a land sharing strategy, or whether we need to change the way that we're doing outreach around prairie dogs and what their value to the prairie ecosystem is. That's but yeah, essentially there's this big PR hurdle that we need to get through and that we need to address it, not just if we want to save prairie dogs, but if we also want to save grassland birds. And at the same time, there are, rustlings of change. This article in Texas Monthly came out recently, and I really enjoyed it. And it did a great job, I think, of highlighting a lot of the value that prairie dogs bring to maintaining grassland ecosystems and a lot of the ways that cattle production systems can work in harmony with prairie dogs. There's a lot of instances where you can find these positive little moments within overall atmosphere of disregard for prairie dogs. But I think the evidence that I'm presenting here to me is a call for the grassland bird world to really think about bringing the relationships that they've built and the all of the positive energy in that field towards helping address this challenge, because prairie dogs are really valuable to grassland birds. So I hope I have convinced you of the power of the prairie dog for grassland birds and the benefits that they have to grassland birds. So yeah, I would just like to wrap up by thanking all the different institutions and funders that have supported me in my overall dissertation research. And yeah, I will just end by saying I'd love to keep in touch with anyone watching this presentation. If you would like a copy of this literature review, which is in the final stages of the publication process and will hopefully be published soon, I would happily email anyone a PDF of this or any other research that I've conducted on birds and prairie dogs. You can find my email here. And yeah, I'll end it there. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Beautiful, really, really interesting. Thank you so much, Andrew. And it was awesome to see a window into what you've been up to these past years and a really comprehensive view of kind of how you've been thinking about prairie dogs and again where the gaps are, which I think is really a great way forward. Happy to take questions, and if people have questions, feel free to stick them in the chat. I have a couple questions myself, but I'll let other people take the floor initially. So the first question is, why are Texans fans of the prairie dogs? Andrew, feel free to give a little bit more detail about that article you mentioned.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't want to misquote the article, but and it's found in Texas Monthly, and I believe I was able to access it without a subscription. So I'll try and drop the link here in the chat. But what this article highlighted was a there was a study that was conducted on a Nature Conservancy owned ranch that was showing that prairie dogs in this instance did not reduce forage quantity in a meaningful way, and that cattle were actually preferring to graze on prairie dogs, which is a relationship that's been documented in some instances, particularly on the southern plains. And so and I think a key piece that this article really highlighted was that uh, this research was done in a collaborative way on a working ranch and uh, really increased local buy-in. And so I think it really just again shows that building relationships are really key. And if you're gonna try and have folks, be open to the information that you're providing. Um,
Awesome. Thanks for that extra information. Next question is from, can you add your email, Andrew? So feel free to write that in the chat. And then Cliff is following up with a question. Have similar studies been done on other keystone mammals like ground squirrels? Maybe you could kind of compare and contrast if you know of any other information out there.
yeah, that's a great question, Cliff. I'm not as aware of those studies because when we did our search, we were looking for prairie dogs in particular, and so we weren't really popping up with things on like other herbivorous burrowing species. But there is a fantastic literature review by Dr. Anna Davidson, who's a major member of the Great Plains Conservation Network, that overall reviews the ecology and conservation of these social herbivorous burrowing mammals, which includes ground squirrels and also all kinds of things across the globe that I wasn't even previously familiar with, like ice rats in Africa and pikas in Asia, marmots, and all these really cool critters. And that literature review I've definitely cited dozens of times throughout my dissertation. So yeah, let's see. I can pull it up here. Um, Yeah, so it's called Ecological Roles and Conservation Challenges of Social Burrowing Herbivorous Mammals in the World's Grasslands. It's a great paper for anyone who's interested in like world grasslands. Um, and then I can provide the URL to that as well.
Awesome. Okay. Anyone else? I don't see any more questions in the chat. I have a question that I'm curious about. Well, a couple actually. I was amazed in that last graph that you showed. Was I correct in seeing that like carnivore reintroduction was like on par, like in terms of the negative feelings with prairie dog restoration?
Yeah, so I'll spend a little more time talking about the study where those surveys came from. So this study was by Kiefer Titus and David Jakowski at Clemson, and they've done a number of landowner surveys at different scales, and yeah, essentially what it was showing is at least in Montana uh, prairie dogs were the species that actually had the lowest overall amount of tolerance, lower than wolves or grizzly bears. And that's just I think critical data that we have to keep in mind. And I think it really um, emphasizes, yeah, just that perception in terms of you viewing prairie dogs as a direct economic loss, no matter what, and the need to use science to address whether when and where that actually is the case versus not the case, um, and when it is the case to think about either incentive programs or protected areas to just do the things to alleviate the human wildlife conflict with production systems. So
I'm
yeah.
just shocked. I am shocked by that statistic. I mean, I think everybody, the apex predators, I think, are more logical in some ways because, they can, they're direct conflict with, but I suppose prairie dogs are as well, right? Or people perceive them as a direct conflict with sort of economic interest. Do you think that is kind of at the root of where all this hatred comes from, or do you feel like there's also because there's also like a cultural aspect of kind of like generations of being steeped in just seeing prairie dogs as kind of the enemy. I'm just curious, like, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly folks on this call who have worked on prairie dogs and with ranchers more directly and for longer than I have. So, I would take their word over mine. But to me, I do think the economic potential conflict is the root of it. But I also think in certain cases it can be exacerbated when um, prairie dogs become a nexus of conflict around federal legislation or regulatory bodies, and then it becomes more about you just have this kind of spiraling conflict that prairie dogs and ferrets are the root of. Um, and then it just takes on its own kind of existence. Whereas like, yeah, I guess the wolves and the grizzlies, it's about the wolves and the grizzlies, whereas the prairie dogs are just like the nexus of, ferrets, grass, all these other pieces. So yeah, that's at least my, read for only having worked in this system for 5 years.
No, it makes a lot of sense, and I think what you said in terms of the way forward, trying to harness some of the power of other species that are maybe less controversial, like these grassland birds, is maybe a way to kind of move the needle on people hating prairie dogs less or being more accepting of them. So very cool. Yeah, I don't see any other questions. I guess did you have any final thoughts, Andrew, before we wrap up here?
Um, No final thoughts. Just thanks everyone for listening, and I appreciate your attention and your interest. If you have any questions about anything or like more details, please feel free to follow up with me over email. My email is in the chat. And then, yeah, I'll just end it by saying that I'm a fifth year graduate student and will be defending in May and on the job hunt soon after that. So if you have any jobs that you can think of an avian ecologist for in the grassland space, by all means, uh, I'm right here. So
Brilliant networking, and I would hire Andrew in a second. I might see if I can actually, but yeah, you need to snap this guy up. He's doing very cool research, and he's got big ideas about what is to come in the prairie dog world. So, Andrew, thank you so much. Very interesting. Found it really, really stimulating, and learned a lot. And we appreciate you coming to give your talk for GPCN. The talk will be has been recorded, and it will be available on the GPCN website. So take a look. It should be uploaded within the next week or so. And thank you everybody for coming. Bye, everybody.